Here's kind of the next stage of the bottom work. One, you want to get the coolant out. So, this one was basically drained, but what I did, I got the coolant tray, and then I found the what they call the radiator petcock. It's right here in white. You can kind of see it right there. So a lot of times that takes a socket or an Allen key. That's basically going to drain the coolant out of the bottom of the radiator. Sometimes if you want, you could pull that lower radiator hose too. But this one I cracked loose. I got that much coolant out of it. Not a whole lot. Now I want to make a point on that. Coolant sucks. It's kind of slimy, slippery. So immediately if you miss and you get it on the ground, I recommend cleaning it up. Otherwise you will have coolant tracks and stuff everywhere. These are just wet tracks right now because I mopped it up. We keep the mops in the cubby. And so, go ahead, get the coolant draining out of it, mop up any little details, pull the wheels, obviously, and then what you're going to have to deal with, we're going to go kind of step by step here, and I'd like to start with the fluids. Depending on exactly how you do this job, you're going to have to do some fluids and not other fluids. So you got to understand the concept. So obviously I'm draining the coolant, that's a must, and I'm draining the oil. So right now I'm going to show you the whole reason this engine's being changed. I got the drain plug already loose, I just have it barely started. So I'm going to pull this plug here, and that is not what oil is supposed to look like. And so, this is the nature of the failure here. Either way, you're draining the oil for whatever reason. So as that oil's draining, I don't need to sit here and watch it. In a minute, when that's done, I'll get the oil filter. I can, as that's draining, start to look at some things. Bang, I go ahead, pop the wheels off probably. Now, I want to discuss how I'm going to deal with this suspension in a really logical way. So I could split this lower control arm from the knuckle, and I could leave the knuckle, the strut, the rotors, all that stuff on the body. But if I were to try to drop just this control arm with the subframe and leave the knuckle, that would mean I'd have to take the axle out. Because think about it, the axle goes to the hub, but the axle also goes to the transaxle, which is coming down. So if you want to do it that way, you can. You'll have to remove the axles, and that's okay. Another way, another way that's typically could be good depending on the model, you can split the strut right here. Right where the strut comes down to the knuckle. And if you pull the strut off the knuckle, you figure the strut is going to stay hanging. The knuckle and, tie rod and everything is going to come down. So that would mean you wouldn't have to deal with the axle nut and the hub and stuff. So that would be, that's a good option. Actually, that's a really nice option. But in this case, these kind of little bolts with the little wings on them, these are eccentric bolts. Their purpose is to adjust camber, essentially. So if I disconnect it by those bolts, these bolts will inherently move. I could mark them, but even still, they're probably not going to end up exactly where they were, which would mean if I split them here, I'm going to have to do an alignment. So I'm going to kind of avoid that, not because I'm scared of it, just because, remember, this isn't about, this isn't about impressing people. It's about doing the job in the least invasive way that's going to take the least amount of time. So I'm going to go up to the top, and I'm going to go ahead and undo those upper strut mount nuts. I'm going to drop the whole entire strut assembly down, meaning these nuts and bolts are never going to move. Those ones up there have no adjustment, so I can undo them and put them back in with no adjustment. That means I don't really have to check the alignment. So now I may do it as a courtesy, but at least that way I don't really have to. So kind of same thing. With that being said, if I'm going to drop this whole suspension assembly, that's going to include the brake caliper. The brake caliper has some brake lines connecting it. You can see there the metal lines. They're kind of buried. Let me show you on the other side. Here's our brake lines, right? That brake line, logically, is attached to the body. It goes along the body, up to the master cylinder, whatnot. So I could leave the caliper bolted onto the bracket and drop it with the knuckle, but to do that I'd have to unbolt the brake hose. If I unbolt the brake hose, now I have brake fluid coming out. If I have brake fluid coming out, when this job's done, I'm going to have to bleed it. And that's fine, that's not that big of a thing. But if I undo the caliper, I undo this bolt right here. You can probably see it without the light better. And then I hang the entire brake caliper and hose assembly, up. This brake caliper is going to stay with the body, and this knuckle and suspension assembly is going to get dropped, I don't have to undo a brake line. I don't have to bleed the brakes. I don't have to deal with bleeding them, and also the potential for problems. You know, sometimes you go to bleed the brakes and it's the first time the master cylinder's gone to full stroke, and you end up with problems with the master cylinder and whatever. So, great, a fire alarm. It's really all about being as least invasive as possible. So if I cannot mess with something, I don't want to mess with something. Additionally, let me point this out. Part of the reason I don't want to pull the axles is check that axle boot out. Yeah, you'll definitely need the light. So I'm going to try to get the light dialed in here. That axle boot right there in the middle, it's going to focus just right. I know it is. I'm just going to help it a little. That is some dry rotting. Right there, bingo. If I start flexing this axle too much, it's going to leak. Now I could tell this customer right now, hey, you need axles because this is going to leak. But then, you know, if we can avoid it kind of better, I'll still advise them. I'll say, hey, you know, those axles are pretty dry rotted. But if you're not careful, next thing you know, you got axles leaking and all kinds of stuff leaking, and it's sort of like, you know, you just want to be as least invasive so that you can kind of save them money and trouble. So kind of the same story with the axles. That mostly explains the suspension stuff. Another item is the exhaust. So logically, the exhaust bolts up to the manifolds here, but it also goes to the body, so it's got to come out. It's got to come out in a way that's going to allow this subframe to clear. I'd shut that alarm off, but I can't, so I'm so sorry. So the way that I found to deal with this was going to be undo this bolt, you know, a couple bolts right there, a couple studs with nuts, and there was a Y-pipe connection. What that looks like is this. Unfortunately, I wanted to split it off there. The very first bolt I got onto, boom, I broke it. And so they're just rusty. It hasn't been apart in a while. So what I'm going to end up doing is actually, it's a stud. I'm going to drive the stud out and nut and bolt it. And as an alternative, I went further back and I got to this point here and I separated it there. That was kind of like a slip joint that's clamped. So it would have been nicer to deal with just up here, but this is, you know, this is what had to happen. So when you're dealing with these, you know, a little WD-40 on the hangers, a little pry bar, you know, kind of separate it. If I wanted to, and this gave me trouble, I could have dropped the entire exhaust assembly, you know, just leaving the bolts in it and just drop the entire assembly out of all these hangers. You know, drop it from the hangers, drop it from the hangers, drop the whole exhaust. Not a bad option, but not really good on this lift. This lift is not good for that. On a two-post lift over there, it would have been a little easier, but it's all good. You know, I got it, you know, detached. You know, to give you some perspective, it actually sits this way. Those go up to our manifolds, and then this was that slip joint in the back. And so you deal with it how you have to deal with it. You know, also one of the big things we're going to have to worry about is the flex plate bolts. Automatic transmission, we've got the flex plate right here, and these, it's really the torque converter bolts. So that bolt that you see bolts to the torque converter. We need to separate the torque converter. We're going to undo all those bolts. How you do it, you pull a cover of some sort. There'll be a cover, and then you're basically going to put a breaker bar on your crankshaft, and you're going to turn, right? So I'm going to turn this breaker bar right now with my hand right here. And as I turn it, you can see I'm moving that whole thing. You're going to have to turn it bit by bit until you expose the bolt. So what I'm going to do is zap this bolt out. Once that bolt's out, I'm going to turn it. And I anticipate, you know, somewhere between 3 and 6 bolts, typically. Once I get all those bolts out, I'm going to verify that as I turn, the flex plate's going to turn, but I'm going to look through and I'm going to make sure the torque converter's not turning. I'll show that in a little more detail. And then I'll kind of try to push the torque converter in towards the transaxle a little. That way when I split the two on the ground, I'll make sure I don't get too hung up on the torque converter and damage some stuff. And so mostly that's what we got to deal with. Because I'm dropping the whole subframe, I'm going to keep the rack on it. And since I'm going to keep the power steering rack attached, that means all the hydraulics and the engine are still going to be kind of together, so I don't have to deal with power steering right now. But the rack and pinion is basically controlled by that steering shaft right there. Now I'm going to show you something, but to do it I'm going to have to put this flashlight in my mouth so I won't be able to talk. So I've got this steering shaft unbolted. That's the bolt. I just want to show you how it kind of separates. And at this point, you got to be a little bit careful, because with this steering shaft separated as so, you ready? Watch. Okay. Lift it up. Okay, now I got the shaft off. You can see. When I have that steering shaft off, I want to make sure I'm very clear. There is nothing holding that steering shaft from spinning in 1,000 circles to the left or the right, which is attached to the steering column, which is attached to the steering wheel, and there's a clock spring in there. And the clock spring is basically an electrical connection for the airbags, the horn, radio controls if equipped. So what you really need to do, you need to hold that steering wheel. You could take the seatbelt and loop around it and then clip it in. You could put a steering wheel holder like from an alignment machine or something. You need to prevent that steering wheel from spinning. If that steering wheel were to get spinning, it's going to break the clock spring. Also, in this one, it's pretty easy. This one has basically one flat. And so, you know, it's a little bright, but you can see it right there. There's just like one flat. I can't put this steering shaft on wrong, but a lot of vehicles are splined. And if they're splined, you'll put a mark on that metal shaft that has the slot that I'm whiting out right now with the light. You put a mark on that shaft, and you'll put a mark on this shaft, and you make sure that when you unspline them, you'll assemble it with the marks lined up. Otherwise, your steering wheel is going to end up off center. So this one's easy, and this is pretty typical of domestics. They do stuff like that. I appreciate that about them. You really just have to get it disconnected, and then when you go to reconnect it, you just have to make sure you get it on the one flat, whereas a lot of the imports, they have splines, and you need to make sure it's on the right spline. And so, you know, when you're considering all that, you're kind of getting it done. Additionally, you're going to want to look around and see if there's anything like a transmission cooler lines. You know, make sure you got any kind of harnesses that are going to hold you up. And then, you know, one of my next steps that I was hung up on were these vacuum lines from before I was talking about. They're way up there. I can't quite reach them. And so my next step is actually going to be I'm probably going to lower it back down and just get this thing on the powertrain lift and start to get the mounts bolted off and get this powertrain to start to drop. I can make it easier on myself by, you know, the main weight is held on this big stud, and these are kind of supports, so I could pull these right out. But if I pull that out, I need to have this whole thing supported, because this is going through the subframe and into the body. So I'm not going to mess with those yet. But I can take out a few of the supporting ones, and that way when I come over here with the powertrain lift, it'll be less for me to do on the powertrain lift. So I'm going to do those few things. I'll do a couple quick clips of, like, you know, I can deal with this these torque converter bolts right now and a couple other little details. And there'll be some little tricky things along the way, but this is the overall preparations. Now, the whole time I'm referencing service info, and I'm just generally thinking of what makes sense. I don't have to follow service info to a T. For example, a lot of times I'm going to tell you disconnect the brake caliper hose, but you know that doesn't really actually make sense if you understand what you're doing, you think about it. So I'm going to do it the way that is going to be most efficient, I'll just say. And so I'm pretty close here, so I'll check in for a couple little details, and then we'll be dropping this baby out pretty soon.